Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we look at the tensions between economic liberty, civil liberty, and political liberty, particularly as these three collide on the streets of Hong Kong. In the second half of our show, Lawson Bader, president of the Competitive Enterprise Institute and our sponsor, tries to put these in perspective within the modern regulatory state. Up first, we welcome Louis Gave, who served in the French infantry after studying Mandarin at Nanjing University, cut his teeth as a banker and financial analyst in Paris, and then moved to Hong Kong, where he co-founded Gavekal Research, serving clients worldwide. The author of 5 books, including Too Different for Comfort, Louis calls us from Hong Kong. Louis, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Louis, Hong Kong has been much in the news lately. We've seen all sorts of activities in the streets, and I do want to get to that, but I want to go back first, if you would. I want you to take us back to the early roots of Hong Kong as the economic powerhouse that it is today, its status as a crown colony under the UK, particularly after World War II. Bring us back to those days and describe what the economic and political system was like.
Well, I think there's so many points you can make about Hong Kong. The first important one is to acknowledge that Hong Kong is a little bit unique in that it's, like the U.S., frankly, an immigrant society. Most of the people who live in Hong Kong are first, second, or third generation people who showed up here because Hong Kong promised free enterprise and a pick yourself up by the bootstrap environment where if you succeeded, you can keep your what you had. So the population of Hong Kong itself is almost self-selected. So already right there, you have a fairly unique set of circumstances that probably you only found back in the U.S. in the 19th and early 20th century. That's the first point I'd make. The second point I'd make is what also made unique in Hong Kong is that it was administered by the Brits, who probably learned from the mistakes they made back in the U.S. And if you go back to the U.S., the big clash that the Brits had with the American colonists was the question of no taxation without representation. And so when the Brits looked at Hong Kong, here was a population that was 90% Chinese. The last thing they actually wanted to give those guys is representation. You have to put yourself back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, an environment where, a lot of things were very much still racially segregated.
Yep, and it was still a colonial mentality.
Very much a colonial mentality. The last thing you wanted to give, the 90% Chinese people was the right to vote. And so, because of the U.S. experience of people fighting when you try to take their money and you don't give them a say as to how you spend their money, the Brits had to come up with a different system to fund themselves here. And they basically came up with a system that was predicated on land sales. So from the get-go, Hong Kong had an extremely, extremely light taxation environment compared to anywhere else in the world. Then finally, the last thing is that Hong Kong, in terms of population, really started to explode in the 50s, 60s, and 70s as communism in China ran rampant and created famines and social upheavals and whatever else. And Hong Kong always had a right of abode law that if you were Chinese and you made it onto Hong Kong Island, you could stay. And so you had a massive surge in population, which by this point, the British colonialists couldn't administer themselves, so they had no choice but to train local civil servants.
And it was a very effective civil service.
Absolutely. It was an effective civil service, but I think that came down, frankly, a little bit to luck in that you had a few right men at the right time in the right places. And specifically, for more than a decade, right as Hong Kong population started to swell, you had a financial secretary in Hong Kong called Copperthwaite, whose vision was right on the money. Basically, Copperthwaite came out, and at the time when the British government was telling him, look, we need more data from Hong Kong, tell us about GDP growth, tell us about unemployment, tell us about industrial production.
Well, the planners needed all that information.
He said, you know what, I'm not even going to bother presenting that information, because if I send back that information to London, by the time you guys turn it around and decide on a plan of action, here in Hong Kong, things will have already moved past. So whatever you end up doing will end up being counter-cyclical. It's a little bit like when you're in the shower. You put it on too hot, and you're like, ooh, this is too hot, and then you put it on too cold,
Right.
and then it's too cold, and you put it on again, and you never get the right temperature. So that was his vision, and he was right. His position was the private sector will adjust much faster than any countervailing measure by the government. By the time the government comes in, it will just solely amplify the cycle.
What I think a lot of contemporary Americans don't understand is there is no tradition of democracy in Hong Kong. I've seen political economists describe it as a no-party administrative state. People just focused on business.
That's true. I would make one important point, which actually Milton Friedman made about Hong Kong, which is that there are in essence three very important freedoms. You have your civic freedom, right of free association, right of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of expression, etc. You have your political freedom, the right to elect your president, your representatives, your senators, etc. And then you have your economic freedom, i.e. the right to start a business, hire and fire people, keep most of the profits from your business, etc. Now, in Hong Kong, economic freedom have always been extremely, extremely strong. Civic freedoms have always been extremely, extremely strong. Free press, freedom of religion, etc. If you look at the whole Asian continent, in fact, arguably Hong Kong has been the place where the civic freedoms were the highest of anywhere. And then we didn't have any political freedom.
At all?
I mean, none at all. We've no elections. Under the British, we never got to elect anyone.
And yet, Louis, the people were prosperous. The economy grew. Everyone was doing great.
Well, see, and here's the interesting thing is when you talk to a lot of the upper and middle class here in Hong Kong, there's an overall feeling that if we go down the path of full democracy, if we go down the path of political freedom, it invariably will eat up into the economic freedoms, in that people will start voting for themselves a welfare state. And then all of a sudden, your ability to hire and fire people will be diminished. Your ability to keep most of the profits from the work you do will disappear. It'll get taxed away.
This has been the case in every other democracy in history.
This has indeed been the case in pretty much every democracy, which goes back to the roots of Hong Kong and why Hong Kong is a special place. What I was saying at the beginning, you have to remember this is an immigrant society. Most of the people who came here decided to come here of their own accord and kind of bought into the sink or swim environment. Now, of course, just like the U.S., you could have made the same point about the U.S. in the late 19th century or early 20th century. Yeah. And then until Woodrow Wilson. And then as you start to move into third, fourth, fifth, sixth generation, then all of a sudden the demand for a welfare state accelerates, etc. And then the U.S. starts to look more and more like Europe. And that's perhaps the path that Hong Kong will now embrace, moving from this sort of bastion of free market capitalism towards evolving more towards a welfare state.
If you look at the Economic Freedom Index, which the Heritage Foundation does, I think Hong Kong has led it by far for 20 years or more. Do people really want to give that up?
Perhaps now that we're rich, we can. As you get richer, 50 years ago, Hong Kong didn't have a choice. It was work or starve. I mean, it's that simple. Just like in the U.S. in the 19th century, if you were a young immigrant, you didn't have a choice. It was a work or starve environment. Now that we're richer, these questions get raised. Having said all this, and I think this is very important, behind the democracy movement in Hong Kong, you have many currents. There is an entire current which indeed strives toward a welfare state. But there is an entire other current which I think potentially has a lot of credibility, which states that if we don't have democracies, then we cannot preserve our civic freedoms. That China will end up eating our civic freedoms because people in China do not have civic freedoms. So if we end up not having democracy, then our civic freedoms will disappear. So it's a delicate balance because the question is, yes, economic freedoms could be threatened if you increase democracy, but if you increase democracy, civic freedoms will be guaranteed and permanent, like they are in the U.S. And frankly speaking, as somebody who lives in Hong Kong and who makes money here and works here, I think civic freedoms are more important than economic freedoms. I don't want the knock of the police on my house at 5 a.m. for no reason.
So, Louis, in 97, Hong Kong was handed over to the mainland Chinese, and you've been quoted as saying something quite fascinating. You said that the tragedy of Asia has been that Japan is a profoundly socialist country on which capitalism was imposed, while China has been the reverse. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think if you look at the societies itself and the values that the societies promote, in Japan, it's an extremely communal society where, the first thing that matters is always and everywhere the community, and the individual is very much subservient to the community. And that's an environment where, socialism can kind of thrive because there is this sort of perception that I don't work for myself, I work for the good of the community. In China, that mentality never really took hold. The communists, of course, came in 1949 and tried to impose that communitarian vision of you work not for yourself, but for the community, for the nation, etc. And it was a complete failure.
It didn't fit the Chinese character, and it killed 100 million of them.
100 million at least. And it was an absolute disaster. Now, the genius of Deng Xiaoping was to acknowledge this disaster. When Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1979, following Mao's death, he looked at China and he said, I control everything. But all this control is worthless because it gives me no power. On the international stage, I'm a complete joke. Nobody takes China seriously. We're a basket case. So I'm going to try to do something. I'm going to deregulate the labor market. I'm going to stop controlling the labor market. I'm going to let people work wherever they want to work and see where that gets me. And sure enough, you start liberalizing the labor market, and all of a sudden, Chinese growth takes off.
Like a rocket.
Like a rocket. Which brings me to one very important point. When I'm in the U.S. and I talk about Chinese growth, people very often ask me, but if you believe in Chinese growth, that means that you believe in government intervention and you believe that governments can generate growth. Not at all.
Yeah.
In fact, the story of Chinese growth is the precise opposite. You can have growth if you move from being extremely stupid to just marginally stupid. That will generate growth because growth comes at the margin.
Yeah.
So if you move from a government that controls everything to a government that controls less and less and less and gives more and more freedom to people, then that's a tremendous growth tailwind. And so China's growth story for the past 30 years has been just that. It's the story of a government that's gradually getting out of the way. In the 70s, or really in the 1980s, it gets out of the way of the labor markets. In the 1990s, it gets out of the way of the real estate market.
Yep.
In the 2000s, it gets out of the way of the commodity markets. And so having liberated and deregulated labor, having deregulated land, having deregulated commodities, we are now entering the final frontier for China in its term of the government getting out of the way through the deregulation of capital.
Yeah, monetary policy.
Yeah, and this is what's the most important thing today, where China is gradually starting to remove capital controls slowly and internationalizing its currency, the renminbi. It's gradually reforming its banks and making them better managed by introducing more foreign shareholders and foreign managers. It is creating an offshore bond market in Hong Kong in a bid to create a proper cost of capital across the yield curve. These are all tremendously important developments and, frankly, very bullish developments.
Well, let's focus on that last piece. What is Hong Kong's role in the greater scheme of moving China toward capitalism?
You've just hit the nail on the head. This is the single most important factor, and I would say question mark today. Because what China's been doing really since the 2008-2009 crisis is internationalizing the renminbi and creating an RMB bond market, but in Hong Kong. Now, the first question you should ask yourself is, why is China doing this? Why is Beijing giving up control of the currency and giving up control of interest rates? And the reason goes back to the crisis of 2008-2009. Up until 2008-2009, China was on a path where exports were growing 20% a year, hereby contributing to growth, and everything was fine. In 2008, 2009, exports collapsed 35%.
Yeah.
And so China turned to the like of Korea, South Africa, Brazil, its trading partners, and said, why did you guys cancel all your imports? To which these guys replied, well, look, when Lehman went bust, we couldn't get our hands on U.S. dollars.
Right.
Trade finance froze. If we can't get your hands on U.S. dollars, we can't buy things from you.
Lubrication disappears.
Exactly. So China says, this is really stupid. Why are we trading in U.S. dollars? Why are we putting American banks in between us? Why are we stuck in this ménage à trois thing? We're not even French. Let's have a committed relationship and trade in renminbi. Now, the guys on the other side say, okay, fine. I'm happy to trade in renminbi, but if I'm going to do that, I need to keep reserves in renminbi.
Right.
So you need to give me assets that I can buy.
Right, which is why you need bonds.
Which is why you need bonds. Now, the funny thing is, in 2009, because of this feedback from the likes of Korea and Brazil, China created bonds that foreigners could buy in Shanghai, government bonds. Mm-hmm. They were called the panda bonds. Mm-hmm. And you traded them in Shanghai. And nobody showed up. Nobody cared. Nobody had any interest. Then China said, okay, I get the message. Forget Shanghai. Our financial center from now on will be Hong Kong.
Hong Kong.
Which brings me to the single biggest comparative advantage that China has that nobody ever thinks of, which is that, if I ask you what's China's big comparative advantage, you might say cheap labor, you might say it's, scale, it's got such a big economy, etc. But another big comparative advantage is that alone amongst emerging markets, China has a deep, liquid financial center that people trust, people everywhere around the world. To build a financial center, that takes 50 years. You need auditors, accountants, lawyers, judges.
Rule of law.
Rule of law. It's not an infrastructure you can build overnight.
The folks in Dubai have been copying the Hong Kong model. They seem to be making some progress.
Yes, they have, but it's peanuts compared to Hong Kong.
Yeah.
And you're right. Dubai started 20 years ago now.
Yep.
And maybe in 20 years it could become a decent-sized financial center. But like I said, it takes 50 years to get there.
But China can't afford to break Hong Kong.
That's exactly right.
What are their fears? Why are they managing it the way they are right now?
So here's the thing. You're China. You're sitting in Beijing. You accept, okay, Shanghai's not going to be our financial center. In spite of everything we've done, everything we've tried, it's just not going to be Shanghai. It has to be Hong Kong. So we're going to push all this business through Hong Kong. All this RMB business, all this bond business, all this bank deregulation business, all of that is going to go through Hong Kong. So you make that decision 4 or 5 years ago. And then you think, okay, well, if I'm going to push all this business through Hong Kong, I probably want to have kind of an overlook or a say on what goes on there, right? Mm-hmm. I want to be able to kind of control the situation because I'm happy to give up all this control, but I don't want to give it up completely. And so you're now stuck in this dynamic where China pushes more and more business through Hong Kong because it's in China's long-term interest. But at the same time, there's still this tendency in Beijing to, well, if it's important, we still need to kind of control it. At which point the Hong Kong people basically say, back off.
Well, can't they solve the problem by just assuring their civil liberties? Can't they forestall democracy by saying, here's your civil liberties, no problem, free speech, freedom of the press, freedom of association, it's all yours?
And I think that's the point of the demonstrations. The point of the demonstrations is really to push back against the Chinese government and say, look, we will rise up if there's any attempt on our civic liberties whatsoever. In this sense, you could see the demonstrations as being quite bullish. It shows that Hong Kong people have a strong backbone and that there's lines, and it tells Beijing, you can't cross these lines. And so from here, where do we go? Mm-hmm. You can take one of several views. The bearish view would say Beijing is going to be pissed at Hong Kong, that basically Hong Kong is spitting in their face, so they're going to be pissed, so they're going to stop pushing all this business through Hong Kong. And they're going to go back to saying that Shanghai is their financial center and push Shanghai as their financial center. The reality is that's not a long-term viable proposition.
Yeah.
It's just that just can't work. The second option is Beijing's going to turn around and try to charm the Hong Kong people. Basically first help the current government, which is very embattled, by pushing even more business through, and give some concessions, as you point out, on civic freedoms. Having said that, we mustn't underestimate, I would say, 95% of the population wants the guarantee on civic freedoms, etc. But there's also a very big part of the population that thinks, look, on a GDP per capita, we're amongst the richest people on earth. Mm-hmm. Why can't we choose our leaders? We're not half-wits. We should be able to vote for our leaders. And this is all the more the case since, frankly, the political leadership in Hong Kong, is perceived, for better or for worse, mm-hmm. to really be pretty poor. While you compare us to Singapore, and Singapore has done so much on things like public housing, on things like managing its public parks, managing its public landscapes, etc. And Hong Kong has really, fallen behind on a lot of these fronts. There's been lacking leadership and the issues of pollution, which have become a real problem in Hong Kong. And then finally, one last point on these demonstrations is there is a sentiment in Hong Kong, although the population in Hong Kong is Chinese, there is a big anti-China component, in that Hong Kong is a small place that's been at the same time overrun by Chinese tourists. So, you want to go out on the weekend, there's right. tourists everywhere.
Can't get a reservation anywhere.
You can't get a reservation anywhere. You get stuck in traffic jams behind tourist buses, etc. That's number one. And then number two, the Chinese come in and have massively bid up real estate in Hong Kong over the past 10 years, to the point where now, you feel like you've got local doctors and local lawyers, etc., that can't afford to live here anymore. So there's this overall feeling of enough with the Chinese.
So, Louis, get out your crystal ball. I'm not asking what's going to happen next week. What's Hong Kong going to look like a year from now?
A year from now, Hong Kong will, A, still be a terrific place to do business. B, it will still be a place where there are political tensions between a local population that wants democracy and Beijing that can't really give full democracy lest that starts spreading to the whole mainland. And C, a place where the local population still feels a lot of tension and aggravation towards the mainland. So all in all, this current status quo, I think, will continue over the next year.
So you think you'll hold on to your spot at the top of the Economic Freedom Index?
Absolutely. Absolutely. To be honest, I don't really see who comes close.
Louis, thanks for your perspective. You've given us a lot to think about, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here.
That was Louis Gave from Gavekal Research in Hong Kong, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. To send us comments and feedback on this or any of our past shows, visit realclearradio.org and click on the email Bill link. Real Clear Radio Hour is a partnership with Real Clear Politics, one of America's top political websites. I check Real Clear every morning for the latest news, polls, and political commentary. Ahead, Lawson Bader of CEI picks up the themes laid down by Mr. Gave and tries to put them into context within our troubled Western democracies. Stay tuned.